Greetings. I am Denise Johnson, presenting Vault Seed Homeschool Collective to Build Racial and Intellectual Identities, a case study under the dynamic leadership and supervision of Dr. Brandy Ray. As a lifelong educator and parent of a Black male who is now in middle school, my concern for Black students and their school experiences is personal. Providing positive learning opportunities where he feels heard, where he is seen, and where his culture is embedded in the curriculum remains a priority and the focus of my work. Issues like generations of poverty, discrimination, and lack of cultural experiences keep Black students from encountering positive engagement in the classroom. In a review of achievement data provided by the National Center for Educational Statistics, a high percentage of students performing below what's considered proficiency levels happen in all areas. So how do we know there's a problem? Achievement gaps between groups of students can inform us on how well we're preparing certain groups of students for success in life and which ones are being left out. With such startling statistics, examining the root causes and historical implications can illuminate what appears to keep Black students' academic performance behind those of their white counterparts. The literature provided the background of the root causes Black youth face in schools. The literature included studies by Franklin, Walker, and Andrews that describe a historical perspective on Black schools and their benefits. Irvine and Purdy's work illuminated pros and cons through Brown versus the Board of Education. Gorski's work and the concerning achievement gap also reflects how culturally relevant pedagogy addresses this gap, illuminated by Latson-Billings' work. It also includes seminal studies of Black homeschooling motivations and practices by Ray, Phil Smith, Lundsey, and Mazama. The purpose of this case study was to describe the practices of a group of Black families choosing to homeschool collectively to form Vault Seed Homeschool Collective and identify how these practices of this group related to Black culture and scholarship shaped the racial and intellectual identities of students within this learning community. Within this community, Black home educators used culturally relevant pedagogy rooted in African-centered frameworks to promote positive outcomes for Black students. I am interested in what can be learned from these practices of these families within this community and how participation in this group shaped the racial and intellectual identities of 5 students. The study's question was how community practices connected to Black culture and scholarship influenced the development of racial and intellectual identities for Black youth within a homeschool collective. The theoretical framework that guides this study is the Wenger's Community of Practice. The Communities of Practice framework, rooted in the social learning theory, allowed me to formulate guiding principles for understanding and facilitating learning within this community. 3 dimensions: mutual engagement, joint enterprise, and shared repertoire define and describe the organization and practices of the Vault Seed Homeschool Collective. It formed the case that makes up this study and its research question. In other words, the communities of framework drove how this community of practice exchanged knowledge, formed relationships, and created artifacts reflective of themselves and the community, shaped and defined approaches to practices used within the community, and informed the data analysis of this study. To share the unique voice of each participant and explore the processes and practices within the Vault Seed Homeschool Collective, of which I was a member, qualitative research was the best design for this study. Qualitative research was ideal for sharing complex information about participants' unique perspective and experiences, which is necessary to describe how this community practiced connected to Black culture, and scholarship, and how it influenced the development of process of these identities. The depth and complexity of understanding this process would not have been revealed by merely responding to surveys. Participants of this study were bound by the number of hours they spent at the center per week and activities they participated in during the community practice. Data collected and analyzed using case study design methods allowed for an evaluative approach to the practices of the Vault-C Homeschool Collective community. As a valuable tool for identifying dominant social and cultural discourse, the qualitative case study led to changes and challenged social norms through inquiry and analysis. I started the Vault-C Homeschool Collective in response of the global pandemic. In addition to providing a safe environment for a group of students, I had the freedom to examine new opportunities for students to develop positive racial and intellectual identities and experience success in school. Housed in a former art gallery, I formed the site for this study. I chose to concentrate on participants in middle grades taught directly by me. The data I collected through observations, interviews, and student journals provided Black youth perspectives on their educational experiences. I formed 6 steps to analyze the data. First, by preparing the data, transcribing interviews, collecting student journals, and responding to observation notes. Exploring the data by organizing those transcripts, highlighting initial thoughts from student journals, and formulating codes. Step 3, I analyzed the data through code data, preparing the data for software analysis, and placing those codes into themes. Step 4, I represented the data by forming discussions and narratives. And I interpret that data by reporting the findings and, of course, validating the data through member checking and triangulation. 4 steps were taken to ensure trustworthiness of the data and analysis. First, I used triangulation methods to strengthen the study's internal validity and trustworthiness. Secondly, I applied member checking. Third, I used qualitative practices where I copied participants' quotes from observations, interviews, and journal transcripts and placed them underneath prior themes that emerged from the data analysis. And then I used a digital database to increase the reliability of the entire case. There were 4 main limitations to this study: the number of participants. I was a leader of this space, which could also stop those participants from giving their true voice. And because of their education levels and income levels, the Black families that make up the Vault-C Homeschool Collective does not necessarily represent those Black families in America. The overview of findings. One finding that emerged from the data analysis phase insisted that members of the community, through a reflective process, have committed to belonging and evolving together. Belonging to such a community involves members bringing their entire Black selves, containing their culture, languages, ways of being, connections to the learning environment, including those elements of self that are constantly evolving and changing. The second finding that emerged during the data analysis phase of this study indicated that members of the community, home educators, and scholars who committed to belonging sought to change in some way as they moved through the learning process and social structure of this community. Because of the present conditions and mistreatment of Black students in public school spaces, the evolution of education must occur. Positive changes in the way we engage students in Black culture, the way they view their own race and intellect, and commit to the evolving learning community were present within the Vault-C Homeschool Collective. In other words, this Black homeschool community made up of Black home educators, scholars, and other community members contributed and decreased the education debt owed to Black youth. A transformation happened as the members navigated through deficit views of their own race and intellect. Community members contributed their skills, talents, and by engaging in the community, creating rich content for learning. Members contributed to the learning environment with their own resources, whether it was knowledge, relevant content, ideas, or the actual building that engaged or that we could engage and learn together in. There were four main practices that emerged from the community. Investments from parental and community partners ensured support, provided resources, and provided positive influences for learners. By providing ample time, learners were allowed to reflect on content, dismantling ideas that subjects and content are separate. Members of this community engaged in open and honest dialogue with no judgment, and it allowed students to bring their true selves to the conversation and learning. And lastly, engaging in cultural reflective curriculum gave students the opportunity to see themselves in the content and processes of the teaching and learning. The implications of this study: Black home educators can provide frameworks and models and resources for homeschooling or for those families choosing to homeschooling. Curriculum developers need to minimize the achievement gap through high-level, culturally relevant educational sources. Community partners, when they invest in communities that serve Black youth, it makes the community, it increases achievement for Black students. And school systems can support these families and alternative ways of learning by remaining supportive and providing more innovative ways for students to take place in learning. So this study can contribute to the scope of Black homeschooling beyond just motivations. It shared the impact on improving educational outcomes for Black youth. It also provided access or provides access to Black homeschool families looking to incorporate culturally relevant practices that promote positive racial and intellectual identities. And it also can inform educators responsible for teaching Black youth in other learning environments. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this study.